So in this paper, I want to use Morris's vision as the starting point to explore the ways in which the ecotopia, or green dream, has taken hold of our imaginations, has shaped them over the last 100 years. And imagination is key here. This is a story about how we dreamed new green worlds in politics, art, and literature. The Green Party are making headlines today, and on their website they say this, quote, "Imagine a political system that puts the public first. Imagine an economy that gives everyone their fair share. Imagine a society capable of supporting everyone's needs. Imagine a planet protected from the threat of climate change, now and for the generations to come." So key in environmental politics, I'm arguing, is the power of imagination. Imagine this. The impulse to tell stories. Stories about a beautiful world that we've lost, or about a new world within our grasp. But William Morris, as we've seen, was also a great image maker, a picture maker. And many of these literary narratives we're about to look at are visions, pictures of the world as it might be. In one sense, in our Western culture, these stories or visions seem to echo the Judeo-Christian narratives that underpin Western society, the narratives of the Bible. Those narratives, of course, tell a story of the beautiful garden, Eden, that we lost, and the beautiful garden city, the New Jerusalem that is to come, at whose centre is the tree of life. And gardens and trees are, of course, central to these visions. In News from Nowhere, the old man Hammond that William Guest meets says of this new society that, quote, "England is now a garden where nothing is wasted and nothing is spoilt, with the necessary dwellings, sheds, and workshops scattered up and down the country, all trim and neat and pretty." And the fact that this utopian society is described as a garden is no accident, evoking the original Utopia, where humans lived in harmony and enjoyed their environment in Eden. And this idea of the centrality of the garden, I think, is important to later visions, as we'll see. But how do these visions relate to the world or worlds as we know them? Whilst the title of Morris's utopian romance, News from Nowhere, suggests the origin of utopia in the idea of the good place that's also a no place, that's where the origins of the Greek word come from, so no place, nowhere. The book is also fundamentally rooted in the geography of London and the Thames Valley. The book concludes with a vision of the very house that Morris had made his home, Kelmscott Manor, in the Oxfordshire countryside, not very far from here. The many-gabled old house becomes in News from Nowhere a picture of the human habitation restored to harmonious relation with nature. Quote, "The swifts wheeled whining about the gables. The house itself was a fit guardian for all the beauty of this heart of summer." Famously, the frontispiece of the Kelmscott edition of News from Nowhere used an image of Kelmscott itself, used an image of the manor house with the writing underneath, "This is the house that we go to at the end of the book." So the image invites us to equate the utopia, the nowhere of the title, with the very house that Morris lived in. It's as if Morris is the prophet preaching to us from nowhere, Kelmscott, and that place is also an idealized version of a pastoral, renewed England. Similarly, the beginning of the novel contrasts the ugly suspension bridge, the shabby London suburbs, and the muddy Thames, with the clear water and the nets for catching salmon in the new Hammersmith. The world of News from Nowhere, then, invites us to imagine a familiar world renewed, clear from pollution, smoke, and smog, restored to its rightful relationship to the natural or the non-human. In News from Nowhere, socialist revolution and civil war have forged this new society. But other visions create their new visions, their renewed worlds from the ashes of apocalypse. Richard Jefferies' After London, published 5 years before News from Nowhere, pictured the capital reduced to a toxic swamp after some unnamed catastrophe, whilst in the rest of the country, new green life springs into bud. Quote, "It became green everywhere in the first spring after London ended, so that all the country looked alike. There was no place which was not more or less green. The footpaths were the greenest of all, for such is the nature of grass where it has once been trodden on. And by, as the summer came on, the former roads were thinly covered with the grass that had spread out from the margin." So such musings, I think, represent a key strand in the history of these ecotopic visions, the capacity to contemplate human absence, to imagine the world without us, to quote the title of Alan Weissman's thought experiment, published in 2007. Movement, growth, and life here happen without human agency. We're invited to watch grass grow, gaze at nettles and wild parsnips pushing up through the soil. We're invited, in other words, to watch humanity take a back seat as plants and animals take centre stage. Note how Jeffrey's passage from After London that I just read kept repeating the word green to reinforce this message. Greenness sits deep in the English psyche. The green man, green sleeves, a green and pleasant land. So as with Morris, and I think with Morris's great master, John Ruskin, Jeffrey's vision depends on an ideal vision, not just of the planet, but of England in particular. There's a sort of specificity, a locality about this. And these visions are not confined, as we look through the 20th century, to writers that we ordinarily think of as being particularly preoccupied with the environment. The end of the English novelist E.M. Forster's curious pageant play, the Avinger Pageant, published in 1934, locates itself in the Surrey village of Avinger, where Forster lived. And it ends with this evocation, quote, "Houses and bungalows, hotels, restaurants and flats, arterial roads, petrol pumps, pylons. Are these going to be England? Or is there another England, green and eternal, which will outlast them? If you want to ruin our Surrey fields and woodlands, it is easy to do so, very easy. And if you want to save them, they can be saved. Look into your hearts and look into the past." So appeals to action here are also appeals to a kind of spiritual vision of England, green and eternal, which will outlast the markers of technological progress. So Forster's image is both rooted to the here and now, Avinger, Surrey, and at the same time posits an eternal England, an England almost with the mind that exists here as a kind of suspended symbol. So I now want to take the story over the Atlantic and into the 1960s and 70s. What the Forster quotation I just read highlights, I think, is the important role of spirituality or mythology in the forming of effective activism. I talked about the green eternal England here as a kind of suspended symbol, a kind of vision which is on the one hand related to life and space now, and on the other hand detached from it, like a kind of sign in mythology. In the United States, environmentalist movements turned to different symbols and mythology. The Whole Earth catalogue, published in the late 60s and early 70s, was a pioneering journal for environmentalist ideas. The catalogue used as its focal image a vision of the Earth as photographed from space. Whole Earth visions stressed the world's unity and interconnectedness. Similar was the extraordinary maverick engineer and architect Buckminster Fuller's concept of Spaceship Earth that he proposed in 1968, a vision, again, that made the Earth strange and exotic. It had also provided the impetus for upkeep and environmental repair of the Earth's ecosystems, as you would the maintenance for a spaceship. But as environmental movements gained ground, especially on the west coast of America, action also often revolved around a local vision of sustainability. Ernest Callenbach's 1975 novel Utopia, from which I take the subtitle of this talk, imagined a northwestern United States that had succeeded from the rest of the country and become an independent state, Ecotopia. All of this is witnessed by a visitor to the country from the US, William Weston. So Kallenbach's vision enabled him to depict a San Francisco, which is the capital of this new state, where the important thoroughfare Market Street has become a mall planted with thousands of trees, the street itself shrinking to a 2-lane road. Quote, "The remaining space, which is huge, is occupied by bicycle lanes, fountains, sculptures, kiosks, and absurd little gardens surrounded by benches. Over it all hangs the almost sinister quiet, punctuated by the whir of bicycles and cries of children. There is even the occasional song of a bird, unbelievable as that may seem on a capital city's crowded main street." So again, as London is in News from Nowhere, the Green City, its architecture and its human inhabitants, begin to merge and blur into the surrounding greenery. The quiet here for this visitor to Ecotopia is almost sinister, broken only by whirring bicycles, crying children and birdsong, all signs that the city is now safe and green. Again, there's a delight in the familiar becoming alien here, as it reverts back, San Francisco reverts back to its natural state. But Kallenbach's Ecotopia is also striking for the central role of myth and ritual in this emerging society. Weston writes, this kind of main figure in this book, Weston writes how he meets a group of Ecotopians carrying fancy bows and arrows with a recently killed deer. One of the hunters writes Weston, quote, "caught my eye, then rubbed his hand over the deer's wound, still damp with blood, running his finger across my cheek, as if to implicate me in the hunt." Game, he later discovers, is prized among the Ecotopians, quote, for its spiritual qualities. Here, tribal ritual, inspired by Native American traditions, I think, has become incorporated into the life of the Ecotopia. Weston also observes ritual war games where young men take different sides in pitched battles, painting themselves in, quote, primitive, fierce designs. A young man injured on the losing side deliberately adopts the iconography of Christ's crucifixion, laid on a red stretcher with a white cross in its centre. And like Christ on the cross, he murmurs, "It is finished," to the watching crowd. Unlike Christ, though, he's not dying to take on the sin of the world, but mimicking the iconography of Christianity in the context of ritualized conflict. Quote, "Ecotopia came into existence with a Judeo-Christian heritage," explains one onlooker to Weston. "We make the best of it. There's also a little ceremony for when a wounded man comes back from hospital. You might guess what it's called. The raising. He stands up and walks." So the actions are stressing the importance of religious ritual in all aspects of Ecotopian life. All of the things that this society does are mediated through myth, through ritual, through tradition. And ritual and mythology were important not just within the world of Kallenbach's novel, but in the communities, the actual eco communities that took root in the American West Coast in the 1970s. By 1977, a journal of Ecotopia was being published in California, advertising the third spring gathering of healers and running articles on synchronicity. As the historian Jeffrey Sanders has observed, Kallenbach's fantastical Ecotopia and the real West Coast environmentalism begin to merge, creating their own mythology of place, which centered around the idea of the Ecotopian bioregion. Just as in Morris's News from Nowhere, the Thames formed the structure and impetus of the novel, so the cities of the west coast of America, the Pacific coast, began to form an imaginative ecosystem, a fantastical geography that pointed both to real environmental activism on the ground in cities like Seattle, Portland, and so on, and to a suspended green vision, a green Jerusalem, if you like, of the spirit. Realising ecotopia, then, has often involved a spiritual, mythological, or at the very least ritual element. In News from Nowhere, the utopian society is also cemented through tradition and ritual, folk singing and commemorative dance. But again, these are threaded into political points about the current state of the nation. The East End slums in News from Nowhere have been cleared and have become the site of this commemorative merrymaking. Here the old man Hammond, who Guest talks to find out about the history of this new society, explains, quote, "Once a year on May Day, we hold a solemn feast in those easterly communes of London to commemorate the clearing of misery, as it is called. On that day we have music and dancing and merry games and happy feasting on the site of some of the worst of the slums, the traditional memory of which we have kept. On that occasion the custom is for the prettiest girls to sing some of the old revolutionary songs and those which were once the groan of the discontent, once so hopeless on the very spots where those terrible crimes of class murder were committed day by day for so many years." So in other words, these political points are also kind of mediated through the idea of ritual, so folk singing, dance, costume, commemorative gesture. These are all important for the kind of society that Morris creates in News from Nowhere. 100 years later, and on the other side of the Atlantic, Ernest Callenbach was creating his own mythology that involved prayers, hymnody, and commandments. His little prayer of global thanksgiving offers, quote, "Thanks to the tropical snake whose venom provides pills for my civilized blood pressure. Thanks to what's left of his harboring rainforest. Thanks to the banana trees of Costa Rica and to the Indonesian mahoganies felled to veneer my bedroom dresser. Thanks to the Canadian spruce cut down and pulped for paper, with which we might enlighten each other." In the Canadian novelist Margaret Atwood's Year of the Flood, published in 2009, and the middle novel of her Mad Adam trilogy, sort of science fiction series of books, she imagines the world immediately before a major biochemical catastrophe has descended, the so-called waterless flood. In the novel, she follows a small ecological cult who've incorporated elements of Christianity, shades of Callenbach's Ecotopia here, to create their own creed of environmentalism. This group, the God's Gardeners, mark the passing of the year through festivals, hymn singing, prayer, and special saints' days. They have saints like Saint Rachel Carson, the author of the book Silent Spring, this very famous environmental book, and Saint Diane Fossey. And the book begins with one of the Gardner hymns, an invocation of the lost garden. "Who is it tends the garden oh so green? 'Twas once the finest garden that ever has been seen." But then greedy spoilers enter the garden and ruin the tender ecosystem. Trees are buried in sand. The water is, quote, turned to slime and mire. The gardeners await the restoration of the garden in the power of God. The narrative of the Year of the Flood sees a world dominated by corporate greed, the menacing corpsicore who control virtually everything in society, and right-wing religious sentiment, the Church of Petroleum, sold out to big oil interests. In this world, the God's Gardeners are a marginal group holding on to hope of renewal, but also to an expectation of God's judgment in the waterless flood to come. Atwood's novel is structured, mediated through the snatches of hymnody, liturgy, and sermonizing from the God's Gardeners group. These sections lend form to the book, a kind of creation and ordering, just as the world the book depicts disintegrates around them. It stresses also, I think, the importance of language in giving shape to ritual and tradition, and I think we'll hear a little bit more about that in Will Aberley's talk this afternoon. And in tradition, in giving shape to the kind of counterculture, the kind of ecological counterculture that Atwood imagines here. And so for God's small creatures beneath the field and wood, let us today give joyful thanks, for God has made them good. So many of the activities that the gods' gardeners are involved in this novel are, I think, recognisable. They meet on the Eden Cliff rooftop garden, keep bees, and grow organic vegetables. Such activity aligns the fictional gods' gardeners with many of the real-life green renewal movements in cities across the world, including the TILF in Seattle, founded in the mid-1970s and inspired in part by Ernest Callenbach's vision of Utopia. TILF means soil suitable for cultivation, and like the gods' gardeners, groups like TILF aimed, and groups like these still aim, to see urban landscapes and post-industrial wastelands renewed, made fruitful. For Adam I, the leader of the gods' gardeners cult, quote, "The flood is coming, in which all buying and selling will cease. We will find ourselves thrown back upon our own resources in the midst of God's bounteous garden." The vision, I think, is for the green tendrils shooting up out of concrete and on the edges of tarmac, pushing up through the cracks of the city. Oh, sing we now the holy weeds that flourish in the ditch, for they are for the meek in needs. They are not for the rich, sing the group in the book. So ecological renewal and its associated tradition, its rituals, its liturgy and so on, are here aligned with a care for the poor and an anger at economic injustice that I think Morris would have recognised. Atwood, like Morris, I think, sees no distinction between social and environmental justice. The gardeners, in another nod to Native American practices, invoke the spirits of extinct animals to give them power to live in the present. In a sermon preached near the end of the year of the flood, their leader, Adam I, petitions, quote, "the dear Diplodocus, dear pterosaur, dear trilobite, dear mastodon, dear dodo, dear great auk, dear passenger pigeon, dear panda, dear whooping crane, be with us at this time of trial." So where on earth does Andy Warhol fit into this, if he fits in at all? The man who seemed so much about a culture of the disposable, a man who in the philosophy of Andy Warhol said he preferred city space to country space. But actually, Warhol's apparent disavowal of the country seems more about capturing a sense of alienation. "I love the idea of being in the country," he said, "but when I get there, it comes back to me that I love to walk, but I can't. I love to sit in the sun, but I can't. I love to smell the flowers, but I can't," and so on. He goes on to say, quote, "I like working better than relaxing. In the city, even the trees in the parks work hard because the number of people they have to make oxygen for and chlorophyll for is staggering. In New York, you really do have to hustle, and the trees know this too. Just look at them." So this is a vision of both the city's human and non-human inhabitants constantly working, hustling, the world as factory, fruitful and productive, but also, I think, sustainable. Warhol was fascinated in his thinking and practice with recycling. Quote, "I always like to work on leftovers, doing the leftover things. What's left over is probably bad, but if you can take it and make it good, or at least interesting, then you're not wasting as much as you would otherwise. You're recycling work, and you're recycling people." There's a sort of vision of sustainability here. As much as Warhol's self-image breathed plastic and disposability, it's also, I think, an all-embracing vision, a vision that took in everything, a whole earth vision, if you like. One of Warhol's later pieces of work, produced in the 1980s, was a series of prints of endangered species: black rhino, tiger, orangutan, bald eagle. The prints showcased the animals in garish colours, psychedelic pinks and oranges, purples and greens. It was, said Warhol, a vision of, quote, "animals in makeup." But it's also another vision of the same impetus that sees the extinct species in Atwood's novels serve as spirit guides or iconic rallying posts. Environmental activism, our dreams of green futures, needs perhaps its own language of myth and symbol. So these writers and artists who we've been looking at are strongly rooted in the world as it is, yet always shaping things their visions of the world as it could be. Thanks.